Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents John P. Slough, The Forgotten Civil War General, by Richard L. Miller. Narrated by David Stifel. Introduction. John Slough settled his heavy-set frame into the parlor's armchair as dusk fell on Leavenworth, Kansas Territory, in late summer 1857. He had worked all day at his prospering legal and real estate practice, and was grateful that friends had invited him to supper. Relaxing in the comfortable chair, he noticed that the parlor was darkening. He raised the wick of the kerosene lamp next to him, inadvertently outlining his large balding head and broad shoulders in the shadows cast by the lamp's flame. Suddenly, shots shattered the parlor's front window. He instinctively dropped behind the armchair to await more gunfire, but his assailant had fled. Slough escaped harm this time, but the attack would not be the last attempt on his life. The American narrative has always portrayed the West as a place of terrible risk and great reward. Immigrants like John Slough crossed the continent to seek new beginnings, despite the West's reputation for violence and premature death. Some came to pan gold in mountain streams, or dig for precious metals in cliffs and rock outcroppings. Others planned to farm or ranch, lured by rumors of fertile soil and lush grasses. Many sought their fortune in selling supplies or providing services in western boomtowns. Some needed a new start, to leave behind a failed business, or escape an unsatisfying marriage, or avoid punishment for crimes they had committed. Others, such as adherents of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sought the frontier's haven for their religious beliefs. All believed that the West offered them opportunity, a chance to win a better life. Those willing to move across the continent, the American narrative promised, had a greater opportunity to gain economic and social status than the less venturesome stuck in their settled lives back east. 19th-century popularizers of the go-ahead system promoted the dream of fame and fortune for any individual willing to take risks and work hard in the American land of opportunity. Those who journeyed west, said the narrative, had an even greater chance of success. Incentive and opportunity were there. Ray Allen Billington and Martin Ridge wrote in their Western Expansion, A History of the American Frontier, men and women only had to apply themselves to achieve wealth and an elevated social status. These were the pioneers whose flatboats brought them down the Ohio River, whose wagon trains dug permanent ruts in the prairie, or whose mules carried them along the Santa Fe Trail. A handful who ventured west achieved extraordinary fame and fortune. Their stories continue to enthrall our imaginations more than a century after they lived. Others failed miserably. Historians have suggested that they failed because they lacked sufficient resources to succeed in the competitive and harshly unforgiving West. They had too little capital, too little knowledge, too little preparation, or simply too little luck. They were the ones who returned east, broken and beaten, or, like the many fallen by illness or accident, died before they reached their destination. In retelling the story of the American West, historians have largely overlooked a set of men whose ambition drove them to prominence in their communities, yet whose shortcomings denied them the lasting fame they sought. Usually they were the sons of the better sort, who, having gone west in search of greater opportunity, achieved success by contemporary standards, but ultimately never attained their greater vision. They enjoyed the resources necessary for success. They had talent, determination, education, often a profession, and usually a circle of acquaintances who could promote their endeavors. These advantages enabled them to serve as leaders of their Western communities, but in the end, they yielded their positions to new competitors with keener eyes and stronger frames. Denied the success they sought, they often moved to new communities to begin again. Today, no monuments remember them. John Potts Slough was such a man. His early years seemed to herald later success. His father accumulated wealth and prestige during Cincinnati's antebellum boom years. That prosperity afforded Slough an education appropriate for a young man from the rising middle class, a profession as a lawyer, and marriage to the niece of a United States Supreme Court justice. His father's connections eased Slough's entry into politics in 1850, and 5 years later enabled the ambitious young man to win election to the Ohio House of Representatives. It was an auspicious beginning to a promising political career. The success Slough's father enjoyed taught the son that America's seemingly endless opportunity provided ambitious, hard-working men the prospect of fame and good fortune. Slough pursued that dream across the American continent for much of his life. From Ohio, he traveled to Kansas Territory in the late 1850s, spent the war years in Colorado Territory and Virginia, and once the war had ended, resumed his quest in New Mexico Territory. Success did not elude Slough, at least as most Americans understood success, yet he never achieved the level of accomplishment he desired. After winning election as a young man to the Ohio House of Representatives, and later establishing himself as a leader of Kansas's Democratic Party, he never gained higher elective office. He failed to earn promotion to Major General during the Civil War, even though contemporaries praised his victory at Glorieta Pass, his role defending Harper's Ferry in May 1862, and his military administration of Alexandria, Virginia. After the war, he longed to return to Colorado Territory as its governor, but failing that, he accepted appointment as Chief Justice of New Mexico Territory. There he struggled to reform the New Mexico courts. It was as if his reach always exceeded his grasp, yet he never faltered in his search for new and better opportunity. If one career stalled, he embraced a new one. If a venture did not pan out, he embarked on another one. His life is not a rags-to-riches tale, yet he embodied the same determination for success that the American narrative ascribes to the 19th-century American character. Certainly, Slough's personality contributed to his failures. Some who knew him described Slough in highly complimentary terms. He was straightforward and intelligent, social and agreeable, a man who demonstrated energy, tact, perseverance, and courage, a faithful and constant ally to his Democratic colleagues. Despite this praise, Slough had an impulsive streak and a hair-triggered temper. He was overly sensitive to perceived slights, which led him to respond in ill-advised ways. His cold and aloof personality prevented him from forming close friendships and a loyal following among his contemporaries. He developed many adversaries who sought to ruin his reputation and block his advancement. All these faults undermined his efforts in the highly competitive atmosphere of mid-19th-century America. Together, they thwarted his ambitions. Aside from Gary L. Roberts' study of New Mexican political violence, Death Comes for the Chief Justice, historians have shown little interest in Slough, even when writing about events in which he chiefly figured. As a result, they often sketch him in unidimensional terms and underestimate his impact. For example, in his well-regarded history of Kit Carson, Blood and Thunder, Hampton Sides characterizes Slough simply as a man with a chip on his shoulder. while Donald Fraser dismisses him as a short-tempered martinet who commanded the 1st Colorado Volunteers. Kurt Anders explains that Slough, a failed Colorado lawyer, earned his brigadier general's star by ignoring his principles. Darlis A. Miller blames Slough's troubles in New Mexico on his contemptible behavior. Sides, Fraser, Anders, and Miller, as well as other historians, misread Slough because they fail to examine the complexity of his character or his achievements over a lifetime of effort. They offer a caricature rather than an historical likeness of the man. They failed to give him the recognition and importance he deserves. Slough's life merits more than brief and unreliable profiles. He enjoyed sufficient fame that newspapers widely reported on his activities between 1857 and 1867. His reputation, one could even say notoriety, among his contemporaries suggests a life worth examining. After all, he knew the period's most prominent men, among them Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Edwin Stanton, John McLean, and Salmon Chase, as well as important Westerners such as William Gilpin, John Chivington, and William H. Larimer, Jr. Because Slough's pursuit of opportunity led him across the country, Ohio, Kansas Territory, Colorado Territory, Virginia, and New Mexico Territory, and his fierce ambition frequently pushed him onto center stage, we can use his life to examine the great events of mid-century. He played a noteworthy role in them: the fight over Kansas's admission to the Union, the Colorado Gold Rush and Denver's beginnings, the Civil War in Virginia, and the corrosive political struggle of Reconstruction in New Mexico Territory. Slough's importance also stems from his participation in events that have received scant attention from historians. The Wyandotte Constitutional Convention, for example, has not been examined at length since G. Raymond Gadert's 1940 book, The Birth of Kansas. Most histories of Jackson's Valley Campaign have ignored the federal defense of Harper's Ferry and occupied Alexandria, the southern city longest under federal military control during the Civil War. Has had little description until Paula Tarnopol Whitaker's recent biography of Julia Wilbur. Slough's life affords us an opening not only to events largely untouched by historians, but also to the interplay between the two great themes of the mid-19th century, westward expansion and the Civil War. In their examination of 19th-century American family life, James and Dorothy Volo note that for the aspiring, only death or physical incapacity relieved a man of his obligation to pursue success. John Slough certainly fulfilled that obligation to pursue success. His life evokes conflicting emotions: distaste for his hypersensitivity, impulsivity, and hot-headedness, sympathy for his enduring repeated attacks on his character, respect for his principled devotion to the rule of law, and above all, admiration for his dogged determination to capitalize on the opportunities his era presented. Ralph Waldo Emerson famously wrote in 1862, "America is another name for opportunity." John Potts Slough well exemplified that vision. His is a story of great opportunity and failed ambition. Part 1. Ohio. Chapter 1. Coming of Age. A boisterous crowd thronged the Cincinnati public landing on a cold February day in 1829, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the President-elect of the United States. They watched as a flotilla of 3 paddle boats approached the city from downriver, steamed past the crowd, amid cannon firing and other demonstrations of applause, traveled upstream about a quarter of a mile, and then circled to sweep grandly down to the landing. On board one of the steamboats, General Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, the hero of New Orleans and the newly elected 7th President of the United States, had chosen to interrupt his journey from Nashville, Tennessee to Washington, D.C. for a brief visit to Cincinnati. Perhaps wishing for some exercise after the tiring journey, Jackson disembarked, bypassed the waiting carriages, and walked to his hotel in a simple, democratic way. Cincinnatians greeted the president to be warmly, cheering for him along the way, even though Jackson, dressed in mourning for his wife Rachel, walked somberly through the crowd. Jackson rested at the hotel for a few hours and then boarded his steamboat to resume the inaugural trip. A young ship carpenter, Martin Slough, likely stood in the rejoicing crowd either through curiosity or support for the president-elect. He lived only a few blocks from the public landing and probably worked in one of the carpentry shops along Front Street. Martin himself had reason to rejoice. He and his wife Mary recently celebrated the birth of their firstborn, a boy they named after Mary's father, John. Martin Slough was born in Pennsylvania in 1802. 2 years later, his family moved to Cincinnati, joining other early settlers looking to improve their circumstances in the fertile Miami Valley. By 1804, when the Slough family arrived, Cincinnati numbered about 1,000 residents. The town was no longer a wilderness settlement. A frame schoolhouse had been built. Travelers lodged at the Green Tree Hotel. The town had 2 newspapers, the Western Spy and Hamilton Gazette, and the Liberty Hall and Cincinnati Mercury. Men gathered at taverns to read newspapers, discuss politics, and conduct civic affairs. For the population's refined element, touring groups of actors regularly performed plays, starting with The Poor Soldier in 1801. Newcomers, like the Slough family, erected 2-story, hewed log houses chinked with mortar and roofed with clapboards, replacing the earlier round log cabins built by the first-year American inhabitants. Comforts had begun to appear. Houses had glass windows, oak-planked flooring, and whitewashed interiors. Chairs, chests, feather beds with quilts, trundle beds, and other furnishings were common household items. Life for Cincinnati's populace, praised by contemporary Dr. Daniel Drake for their industry, temperance, morality, and love of gain, had become considerably more comfortable since the settlement's founding in the late 1780s. Martin Slough's parents uprooted their family from Pennsylvania for the promise of a better life in the growing town on the banks of the Ohio. Little is known about Martin's father, and nothing about his mother. Martin's descendants claim that the family's patriarch was Matthias Slough, a Pennsylvanian and the first colonel commissioned by General George Washington upon assuming command of the Continental Army. There was a Revolutionary War patriot named Matthias Slough, but he never left Pennsylvania. Martin's father and mother, on the other hand, crossed the Alleghanies, determined to improve their circumstances and the destinies of their children. Their son Martin would show his own drive to build a comfortable, prosperous life for his family in the promising city of Cincinnati. It was the broad Ohio River, flowing from Pittsburgh at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers to the Mississippi River at Cairo, Illinois, that blessed Cincinnati's early development. By the time Martin Slough's parents arrived in 1804, the river trade had been established. Flatboats, barges, and keelboats struggled against the current to upstream towns and villages, or made the long haul to the Mississippi and down to New Orleans. Native and foreign-born workers poured into the city, lured by the higher wages and steadier employment than the labor-glutted eastern cities afforded. Population doubled every few years. By 1829, the year of John Slough's birth, Cincinnati had 24,000 inhabitants, making it the largest city in the West and the seventh largest in the nation. It was the focal point of emigration to the West and the region's major manufacturing center. Workers were employed in mills and factories that produced for export great quantities of flour, spirits, textiles, castings, steam engines, farm implements, furniture, and a variety of wood and metal articles. Underpinning the city's industrial growth was steamboat construction. Although Cincinnati shipbuilders fabricated their first steamboat in 1816, the industry did not flourish until 1824, when the United States Supreme Court decided that the Constitution granted Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. The ruling upended steamboat monopolies and opened the nation's rivers and lakes to any entrepreneur with the capital to build and operate a steamboat. Investors calculated that a steamboat, costing no more than $50,000 to build, could return as much as $25,000 profit per voyage. With solid returns and relatively little risk, Cincinnati steamboat construction entered a golden era that lasted 3 decades. By the end of the 1820s, more than a quarter of the steamboats plying the western rivers were constructed in Cincinnati. Martin Slough entered adulthood during the bustling 1820s, and, appropriate for a boy growing up in a riverfront town, chose ship carpentry as his occupation. The earliest Cincinnati directories list no Sloughs, neither Matthias nor Martin. Martin's name, occupation, and address first appear in the 1829 directory. Martin Slough, ship carpenter, Sycamore, between 2nd and Lower Market. His father had died by 1829, leaving his mother, who worked as a milliner, to live with her son and his new family. Martin had married 23-year-old Mary S. Potts in 1828. Within a year, on February 1, 1829, the couple welcomed their first child, John. Their second child, Mary, was born on April 16, 1831, in the family's new home on East Front Street. John and Mary survived cholera epidemics that ravaged Cincinnati in the summers of 1832, 1833, and 1834, and were joined by a baby brother, named after his father, Martin, on June 30, 1835. During the 1830s, buoyed by Cincinnati's rising prosperity, Martin and his young family began the transition from a working-class, artisanal background to an upwardly mobile middle-class life. Martin proved to be an ambitious and enterprising businessman, willing to take advantage of the Queen City's vibrant economy. By 1834, he left ship carpentry to open a coffee house on Front Street close to the public landing. Steamboat construction during the 1820s and early 1830s had been decentralized, with work subcontracted to craftsmen like Martin Slough. As capital flowed into Cincinnati, however, the emerging industrial capitalists centralized ownership and production and abandoned their reliance on independent artisans. Increasing competition from larger centralized firms may have forced Martin to leave his occupation of ship carpenter, although he also recognized that owning a coffee house amid the public landing's warehouses, workshops, and stores was a good business opportunity. His decision to own a coffee house demonstrated that he had attained the economic independence desired by many early Cincinnati craftsmen. Martin operated a coffee house and boarded working men throughout the remainder of the 1830s. By the late 1830s, Cincinnati's coffee houses were under attack. Germans largely owned them, and they freely dispensed both coffee and alcohol. Public opinion, swayed by the city's increasing nativist and temperance feelings, demanded that coffeehouses be suppressed. In response, the city council imposed a prohibitively expensive license on their operation. The new coffeehouse licensing fees forced Martin into keeping taverns. Although contemporaries described his place of business as a coffeehouse in 1840, the 1839 to 1840 city directory lists Martin and his brother-in-law, John Potts, as partners in a tavern. Hard-working and diligent, traits his son John would exhibit years later, Martin also ran a boat and provision store on the waterfront. The 1842 and 1843 city directories record that he owned a small hotel and tavern on the public landing at Walnut Street. He ran this establishment until 1845 or 1846, when he became a lumber dealer, his final occupation until his retirement in the 1870s. By 1840, the city directory also shows a residential address for the Sloughs, separate from Martin's business addresses. The family lived for several years on Front Street, between Vine and Race, in what must have been more a commercial than residential district. The address suggests that Martin valued easy access to his businesses on the waterfront, rather than the fashionable addresses on 3rd, 4th, and 7th Streets. The many craftsmen, boatmen, merchants, and businessmen who worked around the public landing gathered at Martin Slough's coffee houses and taverns, where they relaxed, enjoyed a drink with friends and fellow workers, conversed on the latest topics of interest, and read the local and Eastern newspapers. Politics was always a favorite topic of conversation. Martin was a Democrat, and because the coffee houses and taverns Cincinnatians frequented often became associated with the owner's political party, his establishments served as meeting places for Democrats in the 4th Ward, the political division that encompassed the streets closest to the Ohio River. Martin also forged ties to 4th Ward businessmen and politicians through his honorary membership in the Washington Fire Engine and Hose Company No. 1. By the 1840s, Cincinnati's fire companies served as the breeding ground for the city's political leadership. Men often started their public careers as a fire company officer. Through his membership in the Washington Fire Engine and Hose Company No. 1, Martin met Cincinnati politicians like Othniel Looker, David Griffin, John Kewen, Jonathan R. Johnston, and William Bromwell. The connections Martin made through his businesses and through the Washington Fire Engine and Hose Company facilitated his son John's entry into politics in the 1850s. One seemingly trivial piece of evidence suggests Martin's growing reputation in the Queen City. In 1842 and 1843, he was among 50 prominent Cincinnatians who recommended Guild's patent cooking stove in a series of advertisements run in the Daily Cincinnati Enquirer. Martin's fellow endorsers included such Cincinnati notables as the well-known anti-slavery lawyer Salmon P. Chase, the founder of Cincinnati's first department store, John Shalito, banking, railroad, and insurance magnate George Carlisle, and politician and public education reformer Nathan Guilford. These were important men in Cincinnati history. By the early 1840s, just a generation after his parents started anew in Cincinnati, Martin had joined the ranks of the Queen City's most prosperous and successful men. As his family rose in Cincinnati society, Martin had to consider an appropriate education for his eldest son. He enrolled 12-year-old John in the preparatory department of Cincinnati College. Established in 1815, the school was housed in the finest public building west of the Allegheny Mountains. But by the time John entered in 1841, its building had fallen into disrepair, and its president, the Reverend T.J. Biggs, struggled to pay its instructors. Martin could have sent...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?